Hey, what is going on, guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video we're going to be taking a look at some lesser known tips and tricks that are more so only applicable to the current meta that we're in. So things that have changed over the past couple of months here that are new and you should definitely be looking to implement into your game. Alright, so to start it off here, this first new tip has to do with your early warding. So ever since the Scuttle Crab did get changed and it no longer spawns at 2 minutes, you don't usually want to get a ward in the Pixel Bush anymore. The Pixel Bush ward used to be such a common ward, it would be the go-to ward in previous metas before the Scuttle Crab got changed, but because the crab now spawns at around 3 minutes and 20 seconds, I'm pretty sure it is, you no longer want to ward the Pixel Bush. What you want to do is you want to try to get a ward on the enemy's Raptor camp. That is the best ward right now in the early game because it allows for a few different things. So it allows for you to know exactly where the enemy jungler is pathing, because likely he's going to start his buff. That's pretty much where every jungler starts, and then after that, for example, if he's on blue side, he's either going to go from his red buff to his Raptor camp, or he's going to go red buff to his Krugs, and you're going to be able to know exactly where he passed, because if he passed towards Raptors, you're going to see him on the ward and you know he's most likely going to be going towards top side. If you don't see him on that ward, you know he probably started on the top side of the map, at least for the lower elos. Some junglers right now will go for a red into Krugs clear, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a second, but that path is a lot less common, and I would assume that if you don't see the enemy jungler on that ward, that he has started top side. Now the champion and the time you should be looking to get this ward in, usually the mid laner is the best champion to get the ward in just because he's closest to it and he can get back to lane the quickest. And the time that you should be looking to get it in, just get it in at any point in the early game. Really, it doesn't really matter too much about the time for this ward because you're gonna be seeing the enemy jungler path over that ward really no matter what time you put your ward down. You just want to make sure you know where the enemy jungler is pathing in the early stage. So if you can get the ward in at 40 seconds when you're invading, if you get the ward in at a minute 15 just before the laning phase, then really any time is fine. Now this next tip here stems off the last one, and it has to do with tracking the enemy jungler in the early game. So the path that most junglers take right now, especially in the lower elos, is they'll do buff to buff. Vertical jungling and like going for an early Scuttle Crab is not really a thing, especially in the lower elos. Like you're not going to see the jungler most of the time do their buff and then invade the enemy's jungle. I took a look at a ton of lower elo games and I analyzed like what path that most junglers were taking, and pretty much every single jungler did buff to buff. So if you just track where the enemy jungler is starting in the early game, then you are going to be able to know what side of the map he is pathing towards. So for example, if you do notice that the enemy bot lane shows up later and they're not to lane right away, then you can almost guarantee that the jungler started on the bot side of the map. So you do know he's going to be pathing towards top side, and then your top laner knows to play safe. So no matter who you're playing or what role you're playing in the game, you can let your team know as to where the enemy jungler is pathing with that information as to which laner got to lane first. So if the top laner gets to lane first, then you do know the jungler most likely started bot side. If the top laner comes to lane late, then he probably did get a leash and he's starting on the top side of the map. Now you will see some more unique pathing once you do get up into the higher elos. For example, red into Krugs is a really good path right now if you're looking to maximize your XP, but this isn't something you're going to see very often in the lower elos. So for that last tip, you can almost every single game guarantee that the jungler is going to be doing a horizontal path from one buff to the other, and you can assume as to where he is going to be on the map because of that. Now speaking of the red into Krugs camp, or just taking Krugs early on, it is going to be the best path if you're looking to maximize your XP in the early game, or if you are looking to get a level 3 gank off either top lane or bot lane, depending on which side you are starting. So if you do want to, for example, get a level 3 gank down bot lane, what you can do is, if you're on blue side, you start red, you do Raptors, you do Krugs, and then you gank bot lane at level 3. This is going to be the path that does allow you to hit level 3 the quickest, and because Krugs do give you the most amount of XP for any camp, this is going to be the route that you should be be looking to take if you want to maximize your XP in the early game and you do want to like hit a quick level 6, or if you do want to hit that quick level 3 and look to gank bot. Now this path isn't going to be optimal though for every single jungler in the game. If you're playing a jungler who does not have very good AoE damage in the early game, then this path is not going to be for you. If you're playing a jungler though who does have very good AoE damage, it is a good option to go for, and it should be something that you do look into depending on the game and what you're looking to do. So for an example as to when you'd want to use this pass, say for example you're playing Olaf, and your bot lane is playing something like a Nautilus and a Jinx, just very good CC, very good lockdown. What you can do in this game here is if you're on blue side, you start red with Olaf, you go to Raptors, you take Krugs, you hit level 3 and you look to gank bot lane. A lot of bot lanes, especially in the lower elos, are not going to expect this path because like I said earlier, most junglers in lower elos do not use this path. They're just going to use the buff to buff path pretty much every single game. So if you are playing an AoE jungler like an Olaf and your bot lane does have very good CC that they can use to lock down if you are ganking, this is a great path to use in the early game. Now this next tip here more so has to do with mid lane and top lane, and that is if you do get that ward down on the enemy's raptor camp in the early stage and you do notice when he's taking his raptor camp, what you can do, and this does work better obviously for champions who do have very good shove in the early game, but what you can do is you can try to shove the wave in really hard in the early game, roam over when you do see the enemy jungler taking his raptors or taking his red buff, and just look to get a cheeky first blood on them. You can do this really well with a champion like Rumble. You run the Ignite on Rumble, you do have very good early game damage with your electrocute as well, so you can just look to get a hard shove, roam over there, kill the enemy jungler. You're going to get yourself ahead, you're going to put the enemy jungler very far behind because they're going to have to base, so this is just a really good thing to do and it can help your team out a ton in the early game. So this next tip here is more of a jungle tip and it has to do with Rift Herald. So if you do take Rift Herald before the 14-minute point in the game, you should be looking to use it to drop tower plates and to allow one of your laners to get an even bigger lead in the early game. You'll see this quite a bit in the higher elos. You'll probably see it very little in the lower elos, or at least the intent in the lower elos is not to get this early tower plating gold and snowball their lane even harder. But if you do notice, for example, your mid laner is doing super well, he's snowballing really well in the early game, he's got a few kills. If you can grab that Rift Herald and just use it mid lane, allow him to get a bunch of more gold from the tower plating, it can just snowball the early game really well. And you don't have to always use Rift Herald with the intent to get a tower. You can use Rift Herald with the intent to get tower plates and allow your lane to get more gold from that. So I feel like a lot of the times players are only going to use Rift Herald when they are grouped up and when they want to take a tower, but if you take Rift Herald before 14 minutes, you can just go to the lane that's snowballing, go to the lane that's ahead, put it there, and just allow them to get that extra gold. Now for this next tip here, it does more so come down to personal preference, but in my opinion, for the lower elos, if you are playing a top laner who does have kill pressure in the matchup, I would not be running teleport. I think that teleport, especially with the changes it has received over the time, with it not being able to be canceled now, with it just getting a lot of nerfs over time, I don't think it's worth it for the lower elos, mainly because if you take a look at a lot of your games and take a look at how you're using your teleport, you have to ask yourself, are you actually using your teleport to get your team any sort of advantage in the early game or any advantage at all in the game? And if the answer is no, then I would just be swapping over to something like the Ignite or the Ghost, depending on which champion you're playing. So if you're playing a champion who you do think has kill pressure in the early game, say for example, you're playing a Lowy top lane and you're in a very favorable matchup, just take the Ignite on a Lowy or take the Exhaust. Lowy's TP plays are also pretty weak because she really doesn't have any good follow-up crowd control or good lockdown in her kit, so it's an even better reason for you to take Ignite or take Exhaust, a more offensive summoner spell. It is going to come down to the champion as well, so if you are playing a champion, say like a Kennen or a Maokai, who does have a very good TP flank, then it's going to be much more likely for you to get a good TP play off during that game, and it's going to be more likely for your TP to come into use. So if you do think in certain situations that your TP is going to come into use and you will be able to use it that game, then still take the teleport, but I don't think you should be defaulting to taking teleport every single game if you are playing top lane. Now for these next two tips, they're ones that maybe are not new to Season 9 here and new these past couple of months, but they're ones that are probably lesser known, at least for a lot of lower elo players. So the first one here is that when you're in champion select, you can pretty much know exactly where a champion is going based on which champion they ban, and this is really good for you to use if you're unsure of what champion you want to pick depending on where the enemy champion is going. So for example, if the enemy team picks something like what's a good flex pick right now, something like a Rumble, if they pick Rumble and you're not sure whether he's going top lane or mid lane, then take a look at which champion he banned, and if you see he banned something like, I don't know, a Kassadin, then it's much more likely he's going to be going mid lane than he's going top lane. But if he bans somebody like Darius, he's probably going to be going top lane Rumble. So based on which champion the enemy did ban, you can really get a good idea in champion select as to what role they will be playing. And then lastly, to round out the video, this tip here has to do with before you even get into champion select, and that is if you do notice your queue time reach above 2 minutes, then I would just reset your queue, because if it gets above 2 minutes, what I've found is that the likelihood of you getting off-rolled or auto-filled goes up drastically. Now, I'm not too sure as to what the average queue time is in the lower elos, like if you find a champion select like before a minute in the lower elos or what it is, but at least in the higher elos, queue times are usually around like 1.5 to 3 minutes. So it is going to pretty much every single game that I get into a game before the queue reaches 1:30, I am on my main role and I do get mid lane. But if it does reach above 3 minutes, that's to where I am gonna get auto-filled a lot more likely, or I am gonna get off-rolled a lot more likely. So if you do notice, especially like if your queue time reaches like 3, 4, 5 minutes, definitely reset the queue, because you are going to just have a much greater chance of getting off-rolled in that situation. So that is going to be all for this video, guys. I know this video was a little bit shorter. There weren't a ton of tips in this video, but hopefully it did help you out nonetheless. If you guys did enjoy this video, then be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you have yet to already. So thanks for watching. Have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.